If you followed along in the last lecture, you heard me talk about some things that are going to become very important political issues in the 1970s and beyond, but we really didn't talk about politicians per se as directly as we have in the past. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to change that a little bit. We're going to talk about some politicians and some of their policies with respect to what's going on by that period. But before we do, I want to talk about a changing economy, okay? Let's be honest about something in the post-war period. The fact of the matter is, after World War II ended, we were not only a military superpower, we were also an economic superpower because we were the only participant of the war whose industrial capacity actually increased during the war and certainly afterwards, as opposed to the Germans, the Japanese, the French, the Italians, the British. The primary reason was they were smoldering rubble, right? It's difficult not to be number one when you're the only game in town, and we were certainly number one in the 50s, much of the 60s, primarily because the German, the Japanese economies were still reeling from the war, right? We are going to enter into a time period where those economies are going to become much more formidable, and I'll talk about that in a second. The other problem that the American economy is going to have by the mid-1970s is an energy crisis, okay? OPEC. My guess is you probably heard of this institution known as OPEC, oil producing economies of the world. Many of them, not all, but many of them do tend to be concentrated in parts of the world where America's presence is, shall we say, controversial. Many of them are concentrated in the Middle East. And there have been some things that have gone on in the Middle East that the United States has had some role in that has not necessarily made us an awful lot of friends, okay? Probably most famously, the 1953 CIA coup in Iran that deposed the popularly elected official who nationalized Iran's oil fields and brought back what was popularly known as the Shah, a brutal dictator who the Iranian people suffered for generations under. Okay, there's also this growing tension, shall we say, in the Middle East that involves the Jewish nation of Israel and other predominantly Muslim majority countries in that part of the world, in particular Egypt and Syria. On numerous occasions, the Israeli military had demonstrated that those Muslim world nations were no match for its military. And one of the primary reasons why is the United States had Israel's back. We were and would remain close allies. If you can't beat them on the military battlefield, then you're going to have to find different ways to defeat them. And one of the ways that these oil-producing countries are going to find is to bang up the price of gas. Let's make no mistake about this. Our economy benefited not only from easily accessible fossil fuels, but cheap gas. Let's just be honest about this. It was cheap. And what OPEC is going to do in 1973, 1974 is basically issue an embargo on not just the United States when it comes to who it's selling its product to, but Western Europe as well, right? In any case, what this is going to do is it's really going to pose a challenge to our economy. As you might imagine, it's going to destroy business in Detroit. The auto industry was not prepared to sell cars that were really fuel efficient to American consumers. If you know anything about cars in the late 60s, early 70s, you're talking about muscle cars. You're talking about Mustangs and GTOs and Firebirds, and you get the idea, right? It's getting a lot of people to think about maybe nuclear power as a possible alternative to fossil fuels. And for a long time, we're looking very seriously about going down that road until a nuclear reactor in 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania came very close to melting down. One of these nuclear power plants, if it were to blow up, so to speak, it would be the equivalent of a nuclear bomb going off, and 3 Mile Island really got us to rethink that whole issue of nuclear power. We also know that environmentalism had posed challenges to the fossil fuel industry, beginning with Lyndon Johnson's administration and the Great Society, continuing on to Richard Nixon's administration, and certainly the guy that is going to come after Jerry Ford, a guy that I'll tell you about here in a minute. He's going to pose some serious challenges to the fossil fuel industry. But the bottom line is, we literally ran out of gas in the mid-1970s. It was not a coincidence or not an exception to see signs like that all throughout the United States in gas stations. And the reason that this is such a big problem is our economy ran on gas, and in particular cheap gas. And obviously this is going to pose a very important problem. But going back to this whole issue of a global economy, I need you to understand that by the mid-1970s, not only had the Japanese economy come roaring back, same thing with the Germans, they were producing things that Americans actually wanted to buy. Fuel-efficient cars like the VW Beetle, electronics produced by Sony that Americans really wanted to buy. At the same time, American car companies were producing things like the Ford Pinto, which if you rear-ended it just right, the thing would blow up. So at the same time that it seems like our quality is going down, the Japanese, the German economy is going up, and this is increasing global competition at the same time that the lack of cheap gas is really posing a challenge to this issue as well. Now, what many American CEOs throughout the country are going to say is the problem of these overpaid, underworked, lazy union members. I want you to take a look at that blue line on that graph right there. That line signals productivity. And as you can see, over the course of the late 20th century, the American workforce is becoming more and more productive. Now, there's some things that are sprinkled in there, like the computer revolution. We'll talk about that a little bit later. There's some things like the development of the internet by the 1990s, and certainly we'll talk about that as well. But the bottom line is we're able to produce more and more and more as those years in the 20th century come to a close. Now look at the dotted red line. What the dotted red line is median income in the United States. And you might know that that line is staying flat. What that means is, over the course of the last few decades of the 20th century, workers, broadly defined, were not really, in real dollars, not really making any more money than they were in the late 1970s, okay? And so it's not really an issue involving, organized labor and artificially raising the cost of doing business in the United States, but certainly corporate America would make a case for that. And what they would say is, we don't have any alternative. We need to find different places, more business-friendly places to do business. I told you at the time that in the 1950s, that Labor Management Accord, this truce, peace offering between labor and management, would be a temporary peace offering. And by the 1970s, the war was back on. And this time, corporate America does have this thing it can point to, a declining economy, increased competition, and what it says is, I can no longer afford to do business in Detroit. The unions have made it impossible to do business. They're being paid too much. I need to find somewhere that I can reduce my overhead costs. And so they begin to relocate their factories to places like Tennessee, Arkansas, Arizona, New Mexico, right? Places that were far less receptive to unions and organized labor, if you will. What was left behind, as a matter of fact, you're looking at it, if you're with the PowerPoint with me, right, is typically referred to as the Rust Belt. These old, shattered, shuttered, hollowed out factories that once sort of drove at a bygone time, now they're standing eerily still. You don't see the same sort of workers that are putting money into the local economy. You don't see those corporations that are paying property taxes and also putting money into the local economy. To cities like Toledo, Ohio, Gary, Indiana, Detroit, Michigan, Newark, New Jersey, Oakland, California. The list could go on and on and on. This is going to be devastating, right? So this global economy is going to have so many sort of multiplier effects that it's really going to be a very serious challenge to the United States going forward, this development of a Rust Belt. It is going to be also the time period that we are going to withdraw from Vietnam. What you're looking at right there would be the last helicopter ride out of Vietnam. And you can see that mad scramble of humanity trying to get on it, okay? What you're looking at there is the U.S. Embassy. And in the outskirts of that embassy, you're seeing Viet Cong fighters as well as NVA fighters that are reclaiming the Vietnamese country and uniting it under the banner of communism. Anybody that had sort of buddied up with the Americans, anybody that had not been devout, loyal communists, generally speaking, felt that they were susceptible of some pretty ugly alternatives if the NVA were to come across them. So this is why they're so desperate to get out of South Vietnam. Um, April 30th, 1975 is going to be the last day that we are going to spend in Vietnam. And up to that point, Vietnam was the longest U.S. war in military history. It had claimed upwards of 60,000 American deaths. Many, many more were wounded. It is going to be perceived as our first military loss in American history. Now, do we ever offer our terms of surrender? No, not exactly. But we ultimately don't do what we said we were going to do, which was prevent the spread of communism. Okay? Vietnam is going to be united under a communist regime, and through the early 21st century, it is still going to remain a communist country. And I don't care if you're talking about the Civil War, you're talking about World War I, World War II, anytime you've got a post-war period, you're going to see some recession. You're going to see some inflation, which is going to have an effect on the economy. And in the end, what this is going to do is it's going to lead to more complications and problems in the American economy. So you're beginning to see that this is a really serious issue. Maybe not quite as serious as 1929 and the coming of the Great Depression, but very serious all the same. I think it's very fair to say that this is easily the sharpest downturn, the most painful economic downturn in our history since the Great Depression. A very, very serious issue. And it's on this guy's shoulders that all of this is going to fall. Jimmy Carter was the former governor of Georgia. And when he was elected in 1976, he's going to become the first American from a deep southern state, Georgia, to be elected since before the Civil War. And that was something that Jimmy Carter never missed a chance to tell people, that he was, in fact, a Washington outsider. He was not a part of this good old boy network, and you could trust him when it comes to doing the right thing. He was not Lyndon Johnson. He was not Richard Nixon. He was not Jerry Ford, who pardoned Richard Nixon. He was not part of this social club that was insiders only and had their own kind in the forefront of their mind when it comes to who it served. He said he would serve the interests of the American people. Now, Jimmy Carter might be familiar to you if you know of Habitat for Humanity, the idea of building homes for people that can't afford homes. That was the brainchild of Jimmy Carter, and that was something that he would ultimately win a Nobel Peace Prize for. Jimmy Carter is a guy that's going to make you feel pretty good about American politics, getting back to doing the right thing, reining in the power of the presidency and so forth. But he lacks experience, and he's absolutely no match for a lot of these Washington insiders who oozed experience and really saw an opportunity to exploit Jimmy Carter's inexperience in the process. The first thing that Carter's got to figure out is what to do when it comes to this economy. And to that end, he's going to try to get two things off the ground and moving. Number one, he felt that we needed to have a different policy when it comes to our energy sources. We needed renewable sources of energy, all right? We needed to conserve energy. And this is not a popular message, and I think Jimmy Carter knew that. It was sort of like trying to tell somebody that they need to go on a diet. It's not going to be well received. And as Americans, we like to do things quickly and as painlessly as possible. If there's a pill or if there's a magic formula that we can lose a lot of weight and look like we're going to make the cover of some glamorous magazine, that's what we would prefer as opposed to putting down the fork and jumping on the treadmill and doing it the old-fashioned way. And so The idea that Jimmy Carter had was, let's pay the price right now. And it's not going to be fun. I'm not going to lie to you. It's not going to be fun. But if we do this, it'll pay dividends into the future. We'll be very happy with ourselves going forward. Now, part of that was a national 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. Jimmy Carter felt that this would help us to conserve energy because if we all slowed down, we wouldn't spend as much gas. As you might imagine, that was not very well received. And so, in any case, and no matter how you want to slice or dice this, this is a very deeply unpopular sort of policy that the Carter administration is committing itself to. His other approach would be deregulating the American economy. Okay, I want to make something clear. Jimmy Carter's no liberal. He's not a John F. Kennedy. He's not even a Richard Nixon when it comes to this. Carter felt that part of the problem when it comes to the American economy involved a lack of competition. Part of the reason that there was a lack of competition was that the government got in the way. It made all these onerous regulations, rules, and provisions that prevented anybody that wanted to do business in the American economy from doing business. We don't have time to go through trucking and computing and various other industries, so I'm going to focus on the airline industry for right now, right? What Carter decided to do was deregulate the airline industry, get government policies and procedures out of the way to encourage more competition. The thought being more competition would bring down prices. Bringing down prices would encourage more Americans to book airline tickets. More Americans booking airline tickets would help restore the economy. You see where he's going with this. The problem was that when he deregulated the economy, it was your classic adage of the rich getting richer, right? My guess is you probably haven't heard of airlines like Frontier, TWA. Those of you that are closer to my age might remember the company known as Northwest, but those are all companies, airline companies, that have long since gone away. My guess is you probably have heard of organizations like Delta, like American, like United, right? These are gigantic Goliath organizations, and when Carter got government out, and regulations and rules out of the airline industry, what these giants began doing was buying up their smaller competitors. They began merging, sometimes hostilely, merging with their competitors. And so ultimately this backfires and we don't get more competition, we get less competition. Big airlines became bigger, consumers had fewer choices, and it was a situation where in some cases you almost have something that looks an awful lot like an airline cartel that are monopolizing various markets. My point, Carter doesn't have an awful lot of success in turning around the American economy. It's not Franklin Roosevelt in the sense that maybe it wasn't instantaneous and certainly saw some hard times, but you could also see some very clear-cut progress on the horizon. Now, what would have happened had Jimmy Carter's policies been allowed to sort of unfold into the future? Well, we don't know because, as you're going to find out, they weren't. The only thing worse for Jimmy Carter's presidency than his domestic policy is what's going on outside of the United States. One of the things that's going on outside of the United States, right on the cusp of his reelection, would be the Iranian Revolution. Keep in mind, we had not made ourselves too many friends in Iran in the post-World War II era. And by 1979, the Iranian people had had enough. They had had enough of the Shah, a brutal dictator that they had suffered under. They rose up, the Iranian people that is, they forced him into exile, and they were implementing a revolution. You have to understand that the Shah was a very old man when he was when he was deposed, and he was also suffering from cancer. And so it was into the Americans' arms that he had fled. Now, what the Iranian people were demanding was that he be returned to Iran so he could have his day in court and be tried basically for crimes against humanity. And we said no. And when we said no, they stormed the American embassy in Tehran, and they took 66 prisoners in the process. These prisoners, if you're looking at the PowerPoint slide there, were paraded through the streets of Tehran, the capital of Iran, and it basically served to destroy Carter's presidency. He just never really had an answer to return those hostages, okay? Tried, but ultimately many of those efforts were found wanting. Makes him look terribly weak when it comes to foreign policy. And the only thing worse than the Iranian Revolution would be the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, also in 1979. In that year, you're going to see the Soviet Union expand into its neighbor to the south, Afghanistan, and the United States was still reeling from Vietnam. We can't afford another war, let alone a war with a superpower like the Soviet Union. This is going to make the Carter administration look very, very weak. I mean, here we are. I mean, it doesn't get much more direct and vivid than the expansion of communism than an actual invasion of another sovereign nation. The news would beam images of these Soviet helicopters shooting anything that moved. These just garish images that were coming into American living rooms night in and night out. And although Carter moved to aid the resistance, it was seen as very much too little and way too late. If all of this sounds like it doesn't seem like Jimmy Carter is going to be reelected, it's because Jimmy Carter was not reelected. Instead, you're going to see the rise of Ronald Reagan. I want to mention Barry Goldwater as briefly as I possibly can. In 1964, he's going to be the guy that's going to run against Lyndon Johnson, and he is going to be absolutely destroyed. But the silver lining of that campaign is a very little-known emerging politician by the name of Ronald Reagan, who is going to give this speech at the Republican National Convention entitled A Time for Choosing. And what Reagan is going to ask the American people is, do you think a liberal, intellectual elite in Washington can plan out your lives better than you can? Or do you want to stay true to the tenets and the ideology of the American Revolution? Do you want the American country to continue to stand for freedom, equality, and individualism, right? Now, obviously, Goldwater goes down in flames to Lyndon Johnson, but Ronald Reagan's career is really going to take off in the aftermath of 1964. In 66, he's going to be elected governor to the liberal state of California, where he will implement a regime of strong law and order, right? Lower taxes. In short, he's going to epitomize what conservatives were looking for in a candidate. It wasn't that conservatives just weren't around in the 1960s or early 1970s. They didn't have anybody like Ronald Reagan to bring them in and unite them. Reagan was a once upon a time New Deal Democrat, right? Staunch anti-communist. You also might know that he was a Hollywood actor. He wasn't exactly a Clark Gable or somebody of that variety, and by the 1950s his star had begun to wane. And one of the things that really saved his career was the General Electric company that kind of brought him in as the corporate spokesman. GE sponsored this hour-long TV program called the General Electric Hour, and Reagan hosted it. He was the guy that was selling GE products. But as the spokesperson, he was invited into corporate boardrooms and meetings where he picked up on rumblings that taxes were too high and government was too burdensome when it comes to allowing corporations like GE to do business. And so by the 1960s, he's going to change teams. He's going to become not only a Republican, but a pretty conservative Republican, right? He's also going to have this cowboy-like image, right? In California, he's going to have this image of being a rancher and sort of a Wild West individualistic man. And that's really going to kind of come across as a Washington outsider, somebody that we can get behind when it comes to what is needed for the country at the time. He's also an unmistakable evangelical Christian. He said that his faith guided him, including when he was governor of California. He was an evangelical Christian and he did not care who knew it. If you're following along with me, what this means is he's coalescing along with the emergence of the religious right. There's a lot of things that are coming together for Ronald Reagan all at the same time, late 70s, early 1980s, including the emergence of the new right, okay? Now, for your notes, the new right was a combination of a lot of groups. One was people that were disillusioned with the 1960s and felt that government of any variety, whether it be liberal or anything, was bad, was a problem. And so some of these people were staunch, radicals in the 1960s, only to have their hopes dashed by the liberal consensus, not the conservative. And they will begin to become limited government conservatives by the 1980s. You also have the religious right, as I've already mentioned. They're getting behind Ronald Reagan. You also have your financial conservatives. And I don't just mean corporate, spokesmen and corporate executives, although certainly them. I'm talking about other people, people of the middle class variety, people that voted for Richard Nixon in 1968. The silent majority, people who felt that their taxes, while maybe not exorbitantly high, were going to fund these government programs that didn't work very well. They certainly didn't work for those people like them. They were going to people that were, shall we say, at least the popular opinion of the uh, silent majority was they went for people that were blowing their opportunities. You also see the emergence of Reagan Democrats. These are traditionally industrial workers, union workers, that had voted Democrat for years and years and years. But in 1980, they're going to begin to switch teams. Reagan Democrats were traditional Democratic voters that ultimately warmed up to Ronald Reagan's message of a limited government, lower taxes, a stronger military presence, right? Conservatism, generally speaking. What they also signal is that the New Deal coalition is very, very much dead, and it's a new day in America. Going into the election of 1980, Jimmy Carter's approval rating is hovering somewhere in the vicinity of about 20%, and that ain't not good, right? But the defining moment is going to come in the televised presidential debates, where Ronald Reagan had the last word. And he looked very candidly into the camera. Keep in mind, this is an actor. This is a guy that knows how to sort of play to an audience. He asked he asked the audience very, very bluntly, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And if you do think that you are, then it's pretty clear how you're going to vote on Tuesday. But if you don't think that the American position within the world is as respected as it once was or should be now, if you don't think that the economy is doing as good as it should be or could be, if you're not as bullish as the outlook on the future, if you don't think that your children are going to have it better than you had it, then I can offer a different solution here. And so, as you can see, on election day, voters sent Ronald Reagan to the White House and sent Carter back to Georgia. This is a pretty significant election. It's a landslide election. Reagan leaves nothing to the imagination. We haven't really seen anything like this since 1932. I mean, it wasn't since Roosevelt defeated the incumbent Herbert Hoover on the cusp of the Great Depression that we had seen such a dramatic turnaround. But ultimately, guys, what you're seeing here is the pendulum really beginning to swing back to the political right, right? The Great Depression made the United States an unmistakable left-of-center country. The combination of civil rights, Vietnam, and the downturn of the American economy is going to produce what we call the Reagan Revolution. This is going to make us a right-of-center, conservative country where the conservative talking points are going to really consist of the majority of American political culture. 9 times out of 10, you're going to see a Republican president. 9 times out of 10, you're going to see a Republican-controlled Congress, right? In short, what begins with Richard Nixon in 1968 is going to be complete with Ronald Reagan in 1980. And that's really what I need you to understand about the Reagan Revolution. Now, in our next lecture, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about Reagan's domestic policies and see how this conservative approach to governing is going to affect the American people here at home. But for right now, that's where I want to leave it.